Okay, guys, once this loads, we'll get started here. All right, so we're going to pick up with where we left off last week. If you recall, at the end of the last episode, we were talking about this now infamous Herbert Matthews interview, where a reporter from the New York Times was essentially able to go track down Castro in the mountains. This was very embarrassing to Batista, and his embarrassment is going to be sustained throughout the next couple of years, where he ultimately has to flee the island. So let's pick up right here. Batista was really unsuccessful in finding Castro and the rebels, and this was mainly due to the fact that they were just um, ill-equipped to engage in a full-on search within the mountains. It was very, very difficult to keep tabs on where Castro was. Castro was constantly moving around, and furthermore, they were using the locals within the mountainous region as kind of spies, if you will. But it had the opposite effect because they would usually tell Batista's soldiers the opposite of where Castro was. And so they constantly misled them in the wrong direction. And they just continuously outmaneuvered Batista. And it eventually is going to reach the point where Batista basically realizes that this is kind of a fruitless battle to try and hunt him down in the mountains. And they're going to move to more of a containment strategy to just keep him kind of in the rural parts of Cuba and keep him out of the urban centers of Cuba, because it was just impossible for them to really find the M26-7 soldiers within the mountainous region. So Castro just is really outmaneuvering Batista at every turn here. So here's another picture within basically early 1957. I'm trying to include more pictures in these slideshows so we can see the beards are coming in here, and they're just constantly in this very, very kind of a jungle terrain. So it is important to point out that there were other anti-Batista groups within Cuba at the same time. So one of the ones that we could focus on here, at least briefly, is the DR, the Directorio Revolucionario. And these were, again, college students based in Havana, and they were urgently anti-Batista. And they actually, in March of 57, which is where we're at in the story here, they engage in a fairly significant attack on the presidential palace. And they were using these so-called Fidelista tactics, where they would essentially ambush the facility after some reconnaissance. And they were actually really successful. Batista did not expect this to happen at all. And Batista himself would have been killed had he not gone to his apartment about 15 minutes before the attack happened, because he said he was experiencing headaches. So after the attack and during the attack, there was kind of a full-on engagement with the military in Cuba. 25 members of the DR were killed. And actually at the time, it was just widely associated that this was coordinated from Castro, even though it wasn't. And so, as you could probably suspect, Batista is going to react in pretty repressive manners here. So here's a picture. There aren't a lot of photos of the DR, but here's one of them. Like I said, these were mainly based on college-age students. Again, they were kind of advocates for the rural poor, many of the same ideals as Castro, just not part of M26-7. So, as I kind of alluded to, Batista's response is going to be repression. This is a timeless kind of story when we talk about authoritarian rulers. When they start to feel that their power is slipping away, it's like clockwork. This is typically how they're going to respond. And then, another story that we're going to see played out over and over through the course of history, including in this one, is that when you respond with more repression, your grip on society actually loosens, especially within the context of what we're seeing here with Castro. Because if you think about it, it makes complete and total sense. Castro is advocating against a regime that doesn't treat its people fairly, with respect, within the consistent values that within the values that we expect out of a democratic nation. So, when you're responding with repression and murder and torture and um, extramilitary killings on the street, no judicial process. Well, this is going to play into the hand of Castro, because right in front of people, okay, Batista is basically proving Castro's point. So, over a 20-month stretch, so this is basically going to carry into when Castro ultimately seizes Cuba. Um, Batista would send out the military and arrest anybody appearing to be sympathetic to Castro. He would have them tortured or just executed. So there was no arrest, well, there was arrest, but no trial. And fear works to some extent. Some people will kind of capitulate to the overall fear of the state exacting so much power over their people. But to a larger extent, there are a lot of people who this just angered them. And I think this is relatively understandable, especially if, maybe somebody you cared about or loved was negatively affected by one of these actions. A lot of people, I think, they wouldn't necessarily cower within their homes. They would want to actively participate in the overthrow of this regime. So, as a result of this, Castro's volunteers grew in size as the population began to revile Batista more and more. But interestingly enough, and this is a really common theme throughout this time period that we're talking about here, Castro was constantly in need of more weapons. Weapons equal power. And if you wanted to join M267, you had to bring your own weapons, or else you couldn't join because they couldn't afford to feed you and give you weapons. So, an interesting kind of anecdote that I found is Cubans who wanted to join the army, or Batista, I'm sorry, Cubans who wanted to join M267, there we go, they would search for an army soldier who was alone and either kill them or incapacitate them to take their weapons and then join Castro's movement. And it's estimated that 85% of Castro's guns and ammo came from the Cuban army. So this is a really consistent theme we see throughout this. There weren't a lot of high quality pictures I could find of Batista soldiers kind of arresting people, but this is one, and this is actually in 1958, not 57. So last week I kind of alluded to that we would be talking about the beards a little bit, and it is kind of an important thing to talk about. So throughout this time in 57, when they're kind of navigating throughout the mountains, Castro kept his army constantly moving, and they never really stopped in one location for longer than 24 hours. Access to food was a tremendous hardship, and so they kind of had to rely on local populations to feed them. So this is when his beard kind of developed, and it obviously is famous to this day. It started for practical reasons because they had no razors, but as time went on, it actually proved to be useful because it was easy to kind of distinguish who was a long-term member of M267 and who was just a regular, ordinary civilian. And then also, it was interesting, Batista attempted to try and kind of win this propaganda battle by saying that he was winning the war against Castro and the rebels by by publishing pictures of those killed in battle. But if they didn't have long beards, nobody believed that they were actually members of M267. So, and then, this is a cool picture here from 57 of a peasant kind of reaching to touch Castro's beard. And it just kind of, I don't know, it's emblematic of how Castro is kind of, he's rising to this cult hero status in real time. So, in May of 57, there is kind of another significant battle here at El Uvero. So 80 guerrillas against an entire military garrison, and there were only 53 army soldiers there. Castro took the garrison using Fidelista tactics, and the fighting was over in about 20 minutes, and the army lost 14, another 19 were wounded. Castro only lost 6. So he's consistently kind of decisively winning these military battles against, the trained officers of the Cuban army. And all of these events are published in the local newspapers, and so there's a lot of publicity being garnered about what is happening and how the official army of Cuba is kind of being completely outmaneuvered by these rebel forces. So this was a significant actual military victory, and some people argue that this is probably Castro's first really significant one, basically proving that with the correct conditions and the correct planning, regular army forces could be defeated by Castro's, if you want to call it kind of ragtag group. So Che has an interesting quote here. "We now had the key to the secret of how to beat the enemy. This battle sealed the fate of every garrison located far enough from the large concentrations of troops, and every small army post was soon dismantled." So the other part of this is the psychological value of this victory. They had been constantly moving through the mountains. They barely had enough food. There was doubt. We have the luxury of being able to look back. As students right now, we can look back and we can say, well, they won. But you got to remember too, in the moment, there's no guarantee that you're going to defeat, a president of a country who has his own army. That's quite the undertaking. So this proved that everything that Castro and Che and the leaders of M26-7, everything they were saying kind of came to fruition, and it ended up being true. And it, I like this phrase here, it became like an elixir. Okay. And everybody became suddenly way more committed to the struggle because they knew that it was not some pipe dream, it was an attainable goal. So we're moving into the summer here of 57. And like I kind of mentioned earlier, Batista realizes that spending a lot of time and resources and officers trying to hunt Castro down in the mountains was very, very, very difficult. And so he kind of tried to move to a strategy of containment, which obviously we should be familiar with, but essentially keeping Castro and his soldiers at bay in the mountains, keep them out of the populated regions of Cuba, and maybe they can kind of weather this storm. So, counter-terrorist measures against the civilian population, they became more pronounced. So we're seeing this kind of erosion of what we would basically consider to be, inalienable rights here in our country. Protections against illegal searches, seizures, torture, and then even outright murder. People just being gunned down on the street. There's even a story about a man with a long beard who is gunned down in the street because they assume he's part of M26-7, even though that he wasn't. I didn't mean to skip this. The presidential election that was scheduled for November of 57 is postponed to June of 58. So, we're seeing a lot of these hallmarks of authoritarians. The political system, the institutions, they're not strong enough to keep the authoritarian from doing whatever they want. In this case, we're talking about Batista, the authoritarian. And so it's just another example here of kind of what I was talking about at the beginning of this lecture, is that the harder Batista tries to take a grip on his country, the more kind of his control is actually kind of squeezing out, because people they don't want to be treated this way. And ultimately, these tactics are just aiding Castro, aiding the movement. They're playing directly into what he is saying about them. So, towards the middle of summer in 57, we kind of have the first manifesto. Okay, so this is a term that we love to use in social studies classes, but in this case, it's kind of one of the first time their rhetoric and their outline of what their concrete beliefs are. And this is the first time that it kind of gets published, really since we had the trial of Castro, right before he's sent to the Isle of Pines. So these are also a lot more measured in kind of what he's saying, and it doesn't seem as kind of bombastic or bellicose as I have here. So, number one, a civic revolutionary front with a common strategy for the struggle. Okay, so again, central to Castro's belief system is what is best for the whole of Cuban society. Okay, so he is definitely, he has a liberal mindset. Okay, so generally speaking, we don't need to get into this giant ideological discussion here, but um, he has great value in the promotion of the collective. Okay, so he's worried about the collective state of Cuba. So he, and the other central idea here is that he exists, this organization exists solely, basically, for the overthrow of Batista. So he is saying that there needs to be a provisional government headed by a neutral leader selected by the Civic Association. So he's not saying it has to be him. Free elections within 1 year of the establishment of this provisional government. So, maybe he could be elected. And we should remember this because we're going to see how this ultimately all plays out. Reforms in the areas of political freedom, civil service, civil and individual rights, agriculture, labor unions, and industry. An end to arms shipments from the United States to Batista. And so at this time, there were still arms being shipped from the United States to Batista, but within the next 3 months, they're going to stop. Because as these, like I kind of talked about in the last slide, as Cubans are being gunned down on the street by the military using weapons from the United States, these are still, these events are actually being written about in the United States. Okay, so, like we talked about earlier, Americans at the time, they were pretty plugged into what was happening with Cuba. The New York Times earlier in the year, they had sent one of the reporters down to talk to this man who was attempting to overthrow a leader, 90 miles away from the United States. So Americans were following this. And furthermore, there wasn't necessarily a completely, one-sided story coming out of Cuba. They were seeing both sides. So they were well aware of the kind of activities that Batista was being engaged in, that Batista was engaging in, and it was becoming untenable for American leaders to kind of say that, we're either overtly or covertly supporting this individual who's committing all these, blatant human rights violations. And then so finally here we have the depoliticalization of the armed forces and the abolition of military juntas. And so, a lot of these things that are outlined here, these end up being kind of very common in these right-wing repressive military governments that we saw all throughout Central and South America throughout the middle to late 20th century. And so, not just for this class, but going forward, when maybe in college or you just have an interest later in life, when you look at some of these political situations in Central and South America throughout the middle to late 20th century, these are going to be the same type of things that all of these insurrectionists are going to be fighting against. So Sierra Maestra Manifesto, this is an important document because it kind of logically lays out what it is the Castro movement is kind of hoping to accomplish. Did that work? Okay, so we have the Cienfuegos uprising. So this is a very significant event. So this is in September of '57, and this is a coordinated uprising between actual members of the military, not the army, but the Navy. And what some research has indicated is that naval officers were not as gung-ho about supporting Batista as the army was. And so these disgruntled naval officers actually coordinated with M26-7, and they said, we will kind of help you navigate an attack. And they planned to shell the presidential palace from a frigate while Navy pilots would bomb Camp Columbia. Okay, so this is a serious coordinated attack here with the military. And then M26-7 would then capture the Havana radio stations and call for a general strike. So this was a pretty grand plan here, but the first part of the plan did not go forward. But again, this is a story that we see over and over. Nobody told the rebels, and they were kind of hung out to dry. And so they didn't have the backup that they anticipated. There wasn't the kind of secondary distraction that was supposed to happen. And so Batista responded with brutal force. He called the army in. There were planes that were coming in, and 300 were dead. So Cienfuegos was a military victory for Batista, but not a political victory. It was very significant that members of his own military, would actually actively plan against him. And so again, it kind of just it represents another moment in time where you can see that his power and influence within his own country is clearly slipping. So here's another kind of report of how serious this was. These are some of the naval officers that were kind of engaged in this. So finally, the last thing we're going to look at today is this idea of the Pact of Miami. So we're getting to the end of 1957. So some major members of the other Cuban revolutionary groups, they met in Cuba. Castro was not included, wasn't even told they were going. And they wanted to try and kind of consolidate all of the different anti-Batista groups and kind of some of their different ideas, and just kind of unify under this message that we might have different visions for Cuba post Batista, but let's unify that we all agree that we should be post Batista. And then Castro was unaware of this pact and was enraged when he heard about it. And so he said, while leaders of other organizations are living abroad carrying on imaginary revolutions, the leaders of the M26-7 are in Cuba making a real revolution. So he basically only identified with those who were actually on the ground, engaging in the battle, the so-called men in the arena. So because he rejected this, it had some pretty serious repercussions. Number one, Fidel demonstrated within his own movement that he would not be the pawn of politicians. He established the M26-7 as clearly independent movement, not to be confused with other organizations. He demonstrated his preeminence among any other opposition groups, and any other future attempts at unity would have to include Castro first. So, it really kind of cements him as a central figure within this movement. So, we just went over the whole year of 1957. I don't know, that was probably 15 minutes. Not too bad today. So, next week when we check back in, you guys are going to see probably the last part before on January 9th, 1959, Castro is walking through the streets of Havana, a conquered man. So, I hope you guys have a great week. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure you're checking in with your teachers, and we will have a great day. Oh no, I'm bad at this. Okay.